Welcome, my friend. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, together, we'll open the pages of history and step into the shadows where trust was broken, promises were shattered, and betrayal changed the course of nations. Imagine standing in the heart of history, at the very moment loyalty is undone. A king betrayed by his closest friend, a city abandoned by its allies, an innocent man condemned by his own country. Betrayal has shaped our world more than any battlefield ever has. But what makes betrayal so haunting? Is it the treachery itself, or the silence of those who allowed it? Would Cleopatra's empire have survived without deceit in her palace? Could Constantinople have stood, if not for betrayal, at its gates? Would millions have been spared war, if leaders had chosen courage instead of compromise? These are the questions that echo through time, and tonight, we explore them together. This is Chilling Chronicles, the most haunting betrayals in history, where every story reminds us that the sharpest blade in history was never the sword, but betrayal. So settle in, listen closely, and let the past speak to you. If these stories stir your thoughts, I invite you to share them, leave a comment, join our community, and subscribe, so you'll never miss the lessons history still whispers to us today. Rome, March 44, BCE. The city that ruled the known world stood at the edge of transformation. Julius Caesar had returned from war as a living legend, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor of civil war, and now, dictator for life. His image was stamped on coins, his statue placed among the gods, and his authority extended beyond the reach of any law. To the people, he was a savior who brought bread and peace. To the Senate, he was a warning, the shadow of a king in a city that had sworn never to bow to one again. The fear began quietly, behind closed doors and whispered meetings. Many senators still remembered the Republic's old ways, when no man stood above the law and the Senate's word was supreme. But Caesar had changed everything. His reforms weakened their power, his popularity drowned their influence, and his ambition seemed limitless. When Mark Antony offered him a crown at the Lupercalia festival, and Caesar refused it, the gesture did not reassure them. It only confirmed their suspicion that he wanted to be asked again. Among those who watched uneasily was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man bound by blood to the founders of the Republic. Caesar trusted him deeply, perhaps more than any other senator. Yet Brutus's admiration warred with his principles. He loved Caesar as a friend, but he feared what Caesar represented, the death of the Republic itself. Cassius, an older senator, hardened by rivalry and resentment, saw that weakness and used it. Together, they formed the core of a conspiracy, a brotherhood of 60 senators who convinced themselves that the murder of one man would save the freedom of all. As the Ides of March drew near, the city began to whisper of omens. A soothsayer named Spurina warned Caesar that danger awaited him before the middle of the month. Sacrificial animals were found without hearts, and Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, dreamt of his statue bleeding while Romans washed their hands in it. She begged him not to attend the Senate session that day, but Caesar, ever confident, laughed off the fears. He had crossed the Rubicon and defied the gods before. To stay home now, out of superstition, would be a sign of weakness. That morning, Caesar dressed in white and left his house on the Palatine Hill. Outside, several of the conspirators waited, pretending to accompany him to the meeting. Among them was Decimus Brutus, one of his most trusted men, who gently persuaded him to ignore the warnings. On his way to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate now met, Caesar passed Spurina in the street. "The Ides of March have come," he said with a smile. The soothsayer replied softly, "Aye, Caesar, but they have not yet gone." Inside the Senate chamber, the scene was calm and ceremonial. Caesar took his seat beneath the towering statue of Pompey, his defeated rival, a bitterly symbolic choice for what was about to unfold. Senators surrounded him, pretending to present petitions. Lucius Tillius Cimber stepped forward, pleading for his brother's pardon. Caesar refused. Cimber grasped his toga, pulling it from his shoulders, the signal. Servilius Casca struck first, his dagger glancing across Caesar's neck. Caesar turned, seizing Casca's arm, and shouted, "Villain, Casca, what is this?" But another blade struck him from behind, then another, and another. The chamber erupted into chaos. Senators scattered, their togas stained with blood and panic. Caesar tried to defend himself, but the assault came from every side. Friends, allies, men he had trusted for years. Then, through the blur of pain and disbelief, he saw Brutus. The sight of him broke Caesar's will. Whatever words he spoke are lost to history, though legend remembers one phrase, et tu, Brute. Whether spoken or imagined later, it captured the heartbreak of the moment. With that, Caesar pulled his toga over his face, the final act of a Roman dignitary, and fell at the base of Pompey's statue. 23 wounds marked his body. Only one was fatal. When it was done, the conspirators stood in silence, their breaths echoing in the marble hall. Brutus raised his bloodied dagger and declared that Rome was free once more. But outside, the city did not rejoice. The people mourned. When Caesar's body was brought to the forum, a crowd gathered in shock and grief. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, lifted the blood-soaked robe and showed it to them. His voice thundered through the forum as he recited each wound, naming each conspirator. The people's sorrow turned to rage. Fires broke out. Riots spread. The liberators, who had sworn to restore the Republic, fled for their lives. Brutus and Cassius gathered armies in the east, claiming to fight for liberty, but they were hunted down by Caesar's heirs, Mark Antony and Octavian, the young man Caesar had adopted as his son. 2 years later, at the Battle of Philippi, the conspirators' armies were destroyed, and both Brutus and Cassius took their own lives. The republic they had tried to save was gone. In its place rose Octavian, the first emperor of Rome. He would take the name Augustus, and under his rule, the Roman Empire would begin its long dominion over the world. The daggers that killed Caesar had not restored freedom. They had destroyed the last illusion of it. In the years that followed, the Senate deified Caesar as Divis Julius, the divine Julius. A bright comet appeared in the Roman sky and was declared to be his soul, ascending to the heavens. The people built temples in his name, and his bloodline became the foundation of imperial power. The name Caesar itself became a title, reborn as Kaiser, Tsar, Emperor. The Ides of March did not end the age of kings. It began it. What Brutus and Cassius saw as liberation was, in truth, the final breath of the Republic. And in that moment, the course of Western history changed forever. Julius Caesar's death remains one of history's most haunting betrayals, a story of ambition, loyalty, and the impossible choice between friendship and freedom. It was not only the end of a man, but of an idea that power could be shared among equals. From that day forward, Rome belonged not to its Senate, but to its rulers. And it all began with the kiss of Julius Caesar, the last gesture of trust before the blade fell. History remembers the death of Julius Caesar as the moment when the Republic fell to empire, when betrayal reshaped Rome, and with it, the fate of the Western world. Yet what began in the marble halls of the Senate did not end there. The Roman Empire, born from treachery, endured for centuries, conquering lands, spreading laws, faith, and power across continents. But time, like an old empire, always finds its cracks. The glory of Rome faded, splintered, and was reborn in the east, in a new capital that glittered beside the Bosporus, Constantinople, the last heir of Rome. For 1,000 years it stood as a beacon of civilization, its walls unbroken, its churches gleaming with gold mosaics, its people certain that no force on earth could bring it down. But betrayal, like history, never truly disappears. It waits, and one fateful spring, in 1453, when the world watched in silence, the echo of Caesar's fall returned. This time, not with daggers in the Senate, but with cannons at the gate. It was spring in the year 1453, the final spring of Byzantium. Constantinople, once the greatest city in the world, gleamed like a dying flame on the edge of 2 continents. For more than 1,000 years, its walls had defied the armies of emperors, caliphs, and crusaders alike. But now, that shining city, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, stood alone, surrounded by an ocean of enemy banners. Beyond the mighty Theodosian walls, the army of Sultan Mehmed II stretched across the horizon. At just 21 years old, the Ottoman ruler commanded over 80,000 soldiers, elite janissaries, and the largest cannons the world had ever seen. Against him stood a mere 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Italians, and a handful of mercenaries, under Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Rome. The city itself was a ghost of its former glory. The population, once 1 million strong, had withered to barely 50,000. Its churches were cracked, its palaces half empty, and its treasury exhausted. But its spirit endured. The people believed the Virgin Mary herself guarded the walls, and that no mortal force could break them. The Theodosian walls had stood for over a millennium, triple layers of stone, towers, and moats that had turned back every invasion since the 5th century. But Mehmed was not like those who came before him. He brought something new, gunpowder and patience. Each dawn, the ground shook as the great bombard, a monstrous cannon cast by the Hungarian engineer Orban, unleashed fire upon the walls. The roar echoed across the Bosporus, shaking the hearts of the defenders. For weeks, stone by stone, the once impregnable walls began to crumble. Inside the city, fear grew, but so did faith. Priests led processions through the streets, chanting hymns, while blacksmiths forged weapons from church bells. Emperor Constantine himself fought on the ramparts, his armor gleaming gold beneath the smoke. He refused to flee, declaring, "I will not abandon the city where I was crowned. If the city falls, I will fall with it." Yet, as the siege dragged on, cracks began to form, not only in the walls, but among the men defending them. Suspicion grew between the Greeks and the Genoese mercenaries who controlled the sea gate. Some whispered that the Italians were secretly negotiating with the Sultan to save their ships. Others accused the emperor of trusting foreigners more than his own people. In a city where every life hung by a thread, trust became as fragile as the walls themselves. Outside, Mehmed grew impatient. His army had lost thousands, and supplies were running low. But then came an opportunity, one born not of might, but of mistake. On the night of May 28th, 1453, as darkness fell over the Golden Horn, the defenders made their final rounds. Exhausted and sleepless, a small group of soldiers at the Kerkeporter Gate, a minor sally port near the Blackernay Quarter, left it unlocked after a brief sortie. Whether from negligence, confusion, or treachery, no one could later say. At dawn, Ottoman scouts discovered it. A handful of soldiers slipped through, climbed the inner wall, and raised the Sultan's banner above the rampart. From a distance, other Ottoman troops saw the flag and believed the city had fallen. They surged forward with renewed fury. Inside, panic spread. Rumors flew that the enemy had broken through. Commanders tried to regroup, but the tide of battle had turned. The great gates were forced open, and Mehmed's janissaries poured in. Street by street, alley by alley, Constantinople descended into chaos. The emperor fought until the end. Witnesses claimed he tore the imperial insignia from his armor, so that he might die as an ordinary soldier. Surrounded by enemies near the St. Romanus Gate, Constantine XI Palaiologos vanished into legend. Some said his body was found among the fallen. Others whispered that he was turned to marble by angels, waiting beneath the city to rise again when Constantinople is free. By mid-morning, the banners of the crescent moon flew above Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in Christendom. Inside, a final congregation of citizens and monks prayed as the doors burst open. The conquerors entered, and the world changed forever. Sultan Mehmed rode through the shattered gates. At noon, the smell of smoke and blood filled the air. He dismounted before the altar of Hagia Sophia, looked up at the vast dome, and murmured words that history would never forget. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The ancient basilica became a mosque, and the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. That evening, as fires burned across the city, Mehmed walked the empty halls of the great palace. He found a marble statue of a Roman emperor toppled amid the ruins. For a long moment, he stood in silence, then recited a Persian verse. The spider weaves the curtains in the palaces of kings. The owl calls the watch in the towers of Afrasiab. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the second Rome, was gone. Its fall marked not only the end of an empire, but the dawn of a new age. Scholars fled to the west, carrying ancient manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance. Trade routes shifted, pushing Europe to seek new paths across the seas. The fall of one city reshaped the map of the world. And at the heart of that collapse, amid cannons, courage, and chaos, was a single forgotten act. A small gate, left open, perhaps by chance, perhaps by betrayal. History remembers the cannons, the armies, and the emperor's last stand. But sometimes, the fate of civilizations turns not on great battles, but on a single, unlocked door. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an age, the death of empires built on faith, stone and sword. But history did not stop there. It changed its armor, traded crowns for flags, and replaced emperors with ideologues. The thrones of marble became offices of power, and betrayal, once whispered in palaces, began to echo through entire nations. 5 centuries after the walls of Byzantium crumbled, another leader stood at the height of his power, a man who dreamed not of defending an empire, but of remaking the world in his image. And like Caesar, he too would be haunted by the fear of betrayal from within. Germany. Summer of 1934. The air was thick with tension and triumph. Adolf Hitler had been chancellor for barely a year, yet he already ruled as if destiny had chosen him. His speeches drew millions, his image hung in every home, and his party, the National Socialists, had transformed Germany from the ashes of defeat into a movement that promised rebirth. But beneath the flags and the marching boots, a silent war was brewing, not with foreign enemies, but among the very men who had helped him rise. At its center stood Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, or Sturm, Abteilung, the brown shirts. Röhm was no ordinary subordinate. He was one of Hitler's oldest allies, a comrade from the earliest, desperate days of the Nazi Party. When the movement was little more than beer hall brawls and broken dreams, Röhm's paramilitary force had fought the communists, intimidated political rivals, and carried Hitler's banner through the streets. To many, the SA were the real muscle behind the regime. But by 1934, their power had become a threat. Röhm commanded nearly 3 million men, far more than the German army itself, which was still limited by the Treaty of Versailles. He dreamed of merging the army and the SA under his leadership, forming a people's army loyal not to generals or old aristocrats, but to the revolution, to the traditional military elite, and to Hitler himself. This was heresy. The army's loyalty was vital to his long-term plans, and so the Führer faced the same timeless question that had haunted emperors and kings before him. What do you do when your most trusted ally becomes your greatest danger? Whispers began to spread. Rome was accused of plotting a coup. Himmler, Goering, and Heydrich, men who had once stood beside Rome, now whispered poison into Hitler's ear. They told him that the SA planned to overthrow him, that Rome mocked him in private, that he had grown too ambitious, too unpredictable. Whether those claims were true no longer mattered. In politics, perception is enough to condemn. By late June, Hitler made his decision. The plan was swift, precise, and merciless. On the night of June 30th, 1934, he boarded a plane to Munich under the guise of a surprise inspection. With him were members of his personal SS Guard, men who knew what was about to happen. Rome and his SA commanders were gathered at a lakeside resort in Bad Wiessee, expecting a weekend meeting. At dawn, the sound of engines broke the silence. Cars screeched to a halt outside the hotel. Hitler stormed through the doors, his uniform dusted from travel, fury etched across his face. He burst into Rome Sip's room, ripped open the curtains, and shouted, "Rome, you are under arrest." The man who had once called Hitler my Adolf stood frozen in disbelief. Within minutes, the entire SA leadership was rounded up and taken to prison cells across Munich and Berlin. Rome was locked in Stadelheim prison, given a pistol, and told to end his life. When he refused, 2 SS officers entered and fired. But the purge did not stop there. The killing spread across Germany, a political bloodletting disguised as national salvation. Old enemies, rival conservatives, and even former allies were dragged from their beds and shot without trial. Newspapers the next morning carried a new term that would enter the language of history, the Night of the Long Knives. When the smoke cleared, hundreds were dead. The SA was broken. The army swore loyalty directly to Hitler, and the SS, once a small guard unit, rose to supreme power. The message was unmistakable. No one, not even the men who built the movement, was safe from betrayal. Hitler addressed the nation days later, claiming he had saved Germany from chaos. The crowds cheered, the generals saluted, but beneath the triumph lay a truth as old as Rome, that power built on fear must always feed on its own. History would show that this night marked the true beginning of the Nazi dictatorship. The illusions of unity and brotherhood had died quietly in those dark hours, replaced by something far colder, a regime where loyalty was absolute and betrayal inevitable. And as the world would soon learn, this was only the first act in a tragedy that would consume millions. The Night of the Long Knives had shown the world that betrayal was no longer a whisper behind palace walls. It was now policy. Power had evolved. Empires no longer wore crowns of gold, but uniforms and ideologies. And yet, even before the 20th century drowned in war, another empire had already heard the same footsteps of treachery echoing down its gilded halls. Where Caesar fell to daggers and emperors to cannons, this betrayal came softly, through trust, through blindness, and through love. It was not a single night of murder, but a slow unraveling of faith in a dynasty that had once seemed eternal. The name was Romanov, and their empire was Russia. For more than 300 years, the Romanovs ruled the vast Russian Empire, a realm of frozen steppes, golden domes, and iron will. From the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg to the icy depths of Siberia, their authority stretched farther than any crown in Europe. They were not merely rulers, they were seen as divinely chosen. To defy the Tsar was to defy God himself. But by the dawn of the 20th century, that divine light had begun to flicker. The world was changing. Steam, steel, and revolution were replacing faith and obedience. While Paris and London modernized, Russia remained divided between the nobility, who lived in luxury, and the millions of peasants who toiled in hunger and mud. At the heart of this empire stood Tsar Nicholas II, a man of deep devotion but weak will. He loved his family fiercely and ruled as if the world beyond his palace could be kept out by prayer alone. His wife, Empress Alexandra, was equally devout, a German princess whose accent and pride made her unpopular among the Russian people. Their love was genuine, but their isolation fatal. The Romanovs' fate began to twist with the birth of their only son, Alexei, in 1904. He was the heir to the throne, the future of the dynasty, and he was born with hemophilia, a disease that made even the smallest wound potentially deadly. The royal family hid his condition, terrified that knowledge of his fragility would expose the weakness of the empire itself. In their desperation for hope, they turned to a man who would become one of the most infamous figures in history, Grigory Rasputin, the Mad Monk. Rasputin was a peasant from Siberia with hypnotic eyes and a reputation for miracles. He seemed able to ease Alexei's suffering when doctors failed, and for that, Alexandra came to see him as sent by God. Soon Rasputin's influence grew, not only over the empress, but over the state itself. Ministers feared him, nobles despised him, and the press filled the streets with rumors that the empire was being ruled not by the Tsar, but by a devil in robes. Each scandal deepened the divide between the monarchy and its people. Rasputin's drunkenness, his arrogance, his rumored affairs with noble women, all became symbols of a court rotting from within. Even as Russia marched into the horrors of World War I, soldiers died believing their suffering came from the corruption of their own rulers. By 1916, betrayal was no longer whispered, it was demanded. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, decided that Rasputin must die to save the crown. On a freezing night in December, they lured him to Yusupov's palace on the Moika River. He was offered sweet cakes and wine laced with cyanide, enough poison to kill 10 men. But Rasputin ate, drank, and laughed as if immune. Terrified, Yusupov fetched a pistol and shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell, seemingly dead, only to rise again, moments later, staggering toward the door. They shot him again and again. Finally, they bound his body and threw it through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When it was recovered days later, his lungs were filled with water, proving he had still been alive when he sank. The death of Rasputin, meant to save the monarchy, only confirmed the myth of its corruption. By then, the empire was already collapsing. In February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd turned into full-scale revolution. Soldiers mutinied. The Tsar's ministers fled or betrayed him. Nicholas tried to return to the capital, but his train was stopped by his own generals, who advised him to abdicate for the good of Russia. On March 15, 1817, in a railway car, deep in the forest, Nicholas II signed the document that ended 304 years of Romanov rule. As his pen touched the paper, he said quietly, "May God help Russia." But God was silent. The royal family, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children, were placed under house arrest, first in the Alexander Palace, then in a remote house in Siberia. The revolution had given way to civil war between the Reds and the Whites, and as Lenin's Bolsheviks gained ground, fear grew that the Romanovs might become a symbol for counter-revolution. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, that fear sealed their fate. The family was awakened by guards and told they were to be moved for their safety. Led down to the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, they stood together, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and the young Tsarevich Alexei. A few moments later, a squad of Bolshevik soldiers entered the room. The commander read a brief statement. Your relatives have tried to save you, but it is no longer possible. The executive committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What? What?" before the gunfire began. The room erupted with chaos, smoke, and screams. The bullets ricocheted off the diamonds sewn into the daughters' corsets, forcing the executioners to finish their work with bayonets. Within minutes, the Romanov dynasty, the last imperial family of Russia, was no more. Their bodies were loaded onto a truck, taken into the forest, and buried in a shallow pit. The executioners poured acid over their faces to hide their identities. For decades, the truth was denied. Officially, the Tsar had been executed. But the fate of his family remained a mystery, feeding endless rumors of survivors and hidden heirs. When their remains were finally discovered in the 1990s, DNA confirmed what history had long known. The Romanovs had fallen not to war or rebellion, but to betrayal by their own people, their own ministers, and even their own ideals. The empire that once claimed to be eternal had devoured itself from within. In their deaths, the last echoes of divine monarchy were silenced. From that basement in Yekaterinburg, a new order was born, one that spoke not of kings and faith, but of revolution and ideology. Yet, as with all such beginnings, it too was born in blood. From Caesar's Senate to Constantinople's walls, from Hitler's purge to the Romanov cellar, the story never truly changes. Power breeds fear. Fear breeds betrayal. And betrayal, as history teaches, is the one inheritance that never dies. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked more than the end of an empire. It marked the end of an era. The last flicker of the ancient world was extinguished, and a new age, darker and sharper, rose in its place. Empires would no longer fall to sieges alone. From now on, power would be lost and won in secret meetings, whispered pacts, and the quiet betrayal of one's own. Centuries later, the world had changed beyond recognition. Kings had been dethroned, revolutions had set cities on fire, and the map of Europe had been drawn and redrawn in blood. Yet the essence of betrayal, that quiet, human weakness, remained unchanged. And in 1934, in the heart of Germany, history's cruelest echo returned once more. Berlin was silent that summer night. A strange tension hung in the air, like the moment before a storm. In the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler sat awake, staring into the dim glow of a desk lamp. The room smelled faintly of smoke and ink. Outside, cars rolled quietly through the streets, black sedans with no lights, filled with men carrying secret orders. To the world, Hitler's power seemed absolute. His speeches drew crowds that filled entire cities. His image stared down from walls and banners, but within his own circle, cracks had begun to show. The men who had helped him rise, his stormtroopers of the SA, were growing restless. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, once Hitler's closest ally, had become a threat. Röhm commanded over 2 million men, a private army larger than the German military itself. He spoke openly about a second revolution, one that would sweep away the old elites and the generals who distrusted him. In the cafes of Munich, rumors spread like wildfire. Rome wanted power, real power. Hitler knew what that meant. To keep control, he would have to betray the very brotherhood that had carried him to victory. In the early hours of June 30th, 1934, the purge began. The operation was given a name that would echo through history, the Night of the Long Knives. Across Germany, black cars pulled up in the darkness. Men were dragged from their beds, from hotels, from country estates. Some never even dressed before the shots rang out. In Munich, Röhm was arrested by his own comrades, men who had once saluted him. He was taken to a cell in Stadelheim prison, where he waited in silence for 2 days, refusing to beg. Meanwhile, Hitler himself flew from one city to another, personally overseeing arrests, signing execution orders, and ensuring that no one, not a single rival, real or imagined, was spared. The betrayal ran deep. Generals, party members, ministers, even old friends who had once dined with him, all were turned upon. By the morning of July 2nd, the purge was complete. Over 85 people were officially declared dead. In truth, the number was likely far higher. Rome was shot in his cell, given a pistol to end his life with honor. But when he refused, the guards finished the task. His death was quiet, his name erased, his loyalty repaid in bullets. When dawn broke, Germany awoke to a new order. The newspapers called it a necessary act, a cleansing, a defense of the nation. The German army swore loyalty not to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. Within a year, he had become Führer, supreme leader of the state. The world saw a nation transformed overnight, but few understood the cost. What had once been comradeship had turned to suspicion, friendship to fear. Those who survived the purge learned to keep their voices low, their loyalty unquestioned, their eyes averted. The betrayal that secured Hitler's throne was not just political, it was personal, a deliberate tearing apart of bonds forged in fire, and it revealed a truth as old as Rome itself, that in the pursuit of absolute power, trust is a weakness and betrayal is a tool. As years passed and the war began, those who had once stood beside him would meet the same fate, each consumed by the machine they helped create. The knives that cut in the dark that night would never truly be sheathed again. From the Senate of Caesar to the gates of Constantinople, to the cold corridors of Berlin, history's betrayals had evolved, but the shadow remained the same whisper in the dark, the same fragile thread of trust, ready to break. And as the smoke of that dark night settled over Europe, the world braced itself for what would come next, a betrayal not of men, but of nations. The story of betrayal is often told in corridors of power, behind sealed doors, or in the whispered promises of kings and generals. But in the winter of 1916 it came in the form of a man who was neither noble nor soldier, a wandering mystic, whose life and death would mark the twilight of imperial Russia. His name was Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. Peasant, healer, prophet, sinner. To some, he was a holy man, sent by God. To others, he was a devil who had bewitched the throne. But no matter how history remembers him, one truth remains. His death was the final betrayal of a dying empire. It began far from the palaces of St. Petersburg, in the frozen emptiness of Siberia. Rasputin was born in 1869 in a small village called Okrovskoye, where the winters were endless, and faith was the only warmth against the cold. As a young man, he wandered from monastery to monastery, drawn to visions and divine voices. He returned years later, a changed man, wild-eyed, unwashed, yet carrying an undeniable aura. His words were hypnotic, his presence unsettling. People said he could see into your soul, and somehow he often could. By the time he reached St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, Rasputin was no longer a pilgrim. He had become something else entirely, a man whose touch, many believed, could heal the incurable. At the heart of his legend was Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, a fragile boy suffering from hemophilia, a disease that caused him to bleed uncontrollably from the smallest wound. The imperial doctors had failed him, and every near-death episode left the Empress, Alexandra Fyodorovna, in despair. Then came Rasputin. He spoke softly to the boy, prayed over him, and, Miraculously, the bleeding stopped. No one understood how. Some said it was hypnosis. Others claimed coincidence. But to the desperate mother, it was a miracle. From that moment, Rasputin became more than a healer. He became the Tsarina's most trusted advisor, her holy friend, her intercessor with God, and as his influence grew, so did the resentment of the Russian court. Ministers, nobles, generals, all whispered that the empire had fallen under the spell of a mad monk. By 1916, Russia was collapsing under the weight of World War I. Soldiers froze and starved on the front lines. Cities were gripped by hunger and revolt. Yet within the palace, Rasputin's voice carried further than any general's. He appointed ministers, dismissed generals, and advised the Tsarina on matters of state, while the Tsar, Nicholas II, commanded at the front. To the aristocracy, this was humiliation. To the people, it was proof that the empire had rotted from within. And so, as famine and rebellion grew, the nobles decided that, to save Russia, Rasputin must die. The plot was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to the Tsar, and Vladimir Purushkevich, a right-wing politician. They convinced themselves that Rasputin's death would free the Tsar from manipulation, that killing him was not treason, but salvation. On the night of December 29th, 1916, as the Neva River lay frozen under the moon, Rasputin was invited to Yusupov's palace for what he believed was a private gathering, and perhaps the company of the prince's wife. The cellar was warm, lit by candles, the air thick with wine and cake. Rasputin laughed, ate, drank, unaware that the pastries were laced with cyanide. Hours passed, but the poison seemed to have no effect. Yusupov grew pale. The others, waiting upstairs, grew nervous. Finally, Yusupov fetched a revolver. He returned to the cellar and, trembling, shot Rasputin in the chest. The holy man collapsed, his body motionless. But death did not come. When Yusupov leaned over the corpse, Rasputin's eyes snapped open. He rose, bleeding, and lunged toward his killer. Yusupov screamed as Rasputin staggered up the stairs and into the snowy courtyard, his breath ragged, his blood staining the snow. Outside, another conspirator fired twice more, hitting him in the back. Even then, the man would not die. They beat him, bound him, and finally threw his body through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. When it was recovered days later, his hands were open, as if he had tried to claw his way out of the water. The murderers believed they had saved Russia. Instead, they had hastened its fall. Within a year, the Romanov dynasty would collapse. Revolution would sweep through the streets. The Tsar and his family would be executed in a basement, and the empire that had ruled for 300 years would vanish into history. Rasputin's death had not saved the monarchy. It had sealed its fate. His prophecies, the ones dismissed as madness, came true in terrifying detail. He had once written to the Tsar, "If I am killed by common men, you and your children will rule for generations. But if I am killed by nobles, you and your family will all be dead within 2 years." It was not a curse. It was history's whisper, the last echo of an empire already doomed. In the end, the betrayal of Rasputin was more than the murder of a man. It was the betrayal of belief itself, of faith, of trust, of the fragile illusion that power could control destiny. The nobles who threw him into the icy Neva sought to silence superstition, but they only awakened something far greater, the fury of a nation ready to burn everything it had once revered. And as the winter deepened and the streets of Petrograd filled with protest, the empire began to crumble, not from revolution alone, but from within. For in betraying Rasputin, Russia had betrayed itself. When the Russian Empire fell, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind a world divided, a world where loyalty became an illusion, and truth was something traded in whispers. Out of the ashes of monarchies rose new empires, invisible ones built on fear, secrecy, and ideology. The 20th century no longer needed daggers or poisoned wine. Its betrayals were quieter, written in reports, sealed in envelopes, and whispered across oceans through coded messages. And at the heart of this silent war stood one man whose name would become synonymous with treachery: Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby, the most notorious double agent in modern history. Philby was not born into poverty or desperation. He was born into privilege, the son of a British diplomat and adventurer, raised in comfortable London homes and educated at Cambridge. He was intelligent, charming, and disarmingly modest. People trusted him easily, a trait that would soon become his greatest weapon. In the 1930s, Europe trembled under the rise of fascism. To many young intellectuals, capitalism had failed, and communism seemed to promise justice, equality, and meaning in a world spinning toward chaos. Philby was one of them. During his years at Cambridge University, he quietly joined a small circle of students who shared Marxist ideals. But where others wrote pamphlets, Philby went further. He agreed to serve a cause greater than his country. In 1934, he was secretly recruited by the Soviet NKVD, the precursor of the KGB. He would spend the next 3 decades betraying his homeland, one secret at a time. At first, his work was patient and invisible. The Soviet handlers instructed him to appear utterly loyal to Britain, to blend in, to climb the ranks, to become untouchable. He did exactly that. Philby joined the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIX, during the early years of the Second World War. His brilliance and calm under pressure quickly earned him promotions. While London suffered under the Blitz, Philby sat behind secure doors decoding messages, directing agents, and shaping Britain's global intelligence strategy. To his colleagues, he was the perfect gentleman spy, witty, reliable, patriotic. They called him Kim, after Rudyard Kipling's novel, the story of a boy who served 2 masters without being caught. The irony would later haunt them all. Behind the facade, Philby was feeding everything to Moscow. Operations, names of agents, entire dozens of British and American spies working in Soviet territories vanished because of him. Many were executed. When the war ended and the world split into East and West, Philby was perfectly positioned, a respected officer in British intelligence. Now working directly against the Soviets he secretly served. He was even assigned as MI6 liaison to the CIA and FBI in Washington, giving him access to some of the most sensitive information in the Western world. In that role, he sabotaged one of the CIA's most ambitious missions, the infiltration of Albania, to overthrow the communist regime. The operation was doomed. Before it began, Soviet forces were waiting. Hundreds of men were captured or killed. None suspected that the smiling Englishman, who drank with them in Washington, who spoke of loyalty and courage, had betrayed them all. For years, Philby lived 2 lives perfectly balanced, one built on lies, the other on charm. But the walls of deception began to close in during the 1950s. Another British spy, Guy Burgess, a close friend and fellow Soviet mole, defected to Moscow suddenly in 1951. The timing was too suspicious. MI5 began to question how much Philby knew. His past connections to Burgess and to known communists from Cambridge resurfaced like ghosts. Under interrogation, Philby remained calm, polite, and utterly convincing. He denied everything, with no proof. He was dismissed from MI6, but never charged. For years afterward, he lived in quiet exile, working as a journalist in Beirut. To many, he seemed a man ruined by rumor, a casualty of Cold War paranoia. But the truth was far from over. In Beirut, Philby drank heavily, yet his mind remained sharp. He filed articles by day and coded messages to Moscow by night. For the Soviets, he was still an asset, though one growing reckless. For the British, he was a ghost they couldn't quite let go of. By the early 1960s, however, a new investigation began to close in. Former KGB officers had defected, and one of them, Anatoly Golitsyn, revealed the existence of a deeply placed British double agent. The trail once again pointed to Philby. He could sense it. In January 1963, as British authorities prepared to confront him, Philby disappeared. For weeks, no one knew where he had gone. Then, like a vanishing act from another age, news arrived from the east. Kim Philby had defected to the Soviet Union. He arrived in Moscow aboard a Soviet freighter, his face pale in the freezing wind, his life in the West erased behind him. But betrayal, even when successful, rarely rewards its architects. Philby was given an apartment, a salary, and honors from the KGB, yet he was never truly trusted. He lived the rest of his life in quiet isolation, haunted by guilt and nostalgia. He missed English pubs, cricket, and the rhythm of London rain. His Soviet hosts monitored his every word. The man who had fooled an empire now found himself a prisoner of his own double life. He died in 1988. An old man in Moscow, his name still cursed in London, and still revered in KGB legend. Kim Philby's betrayal was not born from greed, but from conviction, from the dangerous belief that one man could serve two masters and keep his soul intact. His story marked the end of an age when spies were gentlemen and lies could be buried beneath charm. He left behind a question that still lingers in the shadows of every intelligence service today. Was he a traitor or a believer who simply chose the wrong God? And perhaps that is the deepest form of betrayal, not of a nation, but of truth itself. The Romanovs were gone, the monarchs of Europe shaken, and the Great War that had consumed millions finally fell silent. But peace, when it came, carried the scent not of healing, but of humiliation. In 1919, in the gilded halls of the Palace of Versailles, the victors of war gathered to draft a peace so fragile and so bitter that it would betray an entire generation yet unborn. Europe was unrecognizable. Fields that had once grown wheat were littered with shell casings. Villages had become craters. Kingdoms, Austrian, Ottoman, German, Russian, had vanished in a storm of revolution and exhaustion. Out of this ruin, diplomats and leaders arrived in Versailles to carve a new world order, promising peace for all time. But behind the marble pillars and velvet drapes, ambition and revenge whispered louder than idealism. The key architect of this new order, Woodrow Wilson, spoke of self-determination and a League of Nations to preserve peace. Yet even as he wrote of unity, others sharpened pens like daggers. Georges Clemenceau of France demanded security and retribution. David Lloyd George of Britain sought to balance punishment with pragmatism. Around them stood men representing empires at their twilight, each guarding their spoils like wounded beasts. At the heart of the debate stood Germany, defeated, starving, humiliated. Its representatives were summoned not as equals but as criminals. They were forced to enter the Hall of Mirrors, the same room where, half a century earlier, Prussia had declared the German Empire's birth. Now they came to sign its death warrant. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles, finalized in June 1919, were harsh, beyond precedent. Germany was stripped of its colonies, its army reduced to a token force, its economy shackled by reparations so immense they could never be paid. Most of all, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, declared Germany solely responsible for the war and all its damage. The ink had barely dried before bitterness began to ferment. Across Germany, families of soldiers who had died in the trenches felt betrayed not just by their enemies, but by their own leaders who had accepted the terms. Newspapers spoke of a Dolchstoß, the stab-in-the-back myth, claiming that Germany's army had been undefeated in the field, but betrayed by civilians, Jews, and socialists at home. It was a lie, but a lie that grew roots deep enough to poison a nation. In Paris and London, politicians celebrated the treaty as justice, but in truth, the peace they forged carried the DNA of another war. Economists like John Maynard Keynes warned that the reparations would crush Germany and destabilize Europe. His warnings went unheeded. Factories closed, inflation soared, and resentment turned to rage. In the years that followed, small nationalist groups began to gather in Munich's beer halls, their rhetoric filled with vengeance and betrayal. Among them stood a failed artist and former corporal, Adolf Hitler, who would seize upon the mythology born at Versailles. For him, betrayal was not a word of shame but a tool, a weapon to rally a wounded nation. Elsewhere, the victors too faced the betrayal of their promises. Colonies that had fought for the Allied cause, from India to Africa, hoped Versailles would bring independence. Instead, they received new masters under the mandate system. For millions across Asia and Africa, Versailles was not a treaty of peace, but a declaration that the age of empire still lived, dressed in new language. Even Woodrow Wilson, the man who dreamed of a League of Nations, returned home to find his own country unwilling to join it. The Senate rejected the treaty. The United States turned inward, leaving Europe to nurse its bitterness alone. The idealist who had promised the world a new dawn died broken, betrayed by politics and by the very cynicism he had tried to overcome. In the years that followed, the world slid quietly into economic collapse and ideological war. The treaty meant to secure peace, instead sowed the seeds of fascism and totalitarianism. Each article, each signature, became a fault line waiting to break. By 1939, just 20 years later, Europe would again drown in war, proof that betrayal, once written into history, can last longer than memory itself. The Treaty of Versailles stands as one of the greatest paradoxes in history. A peace born from victory, but doomed by vengeance. It betrayed soldiers who had died believing they fought for a better world, betrayed nations promised self-determination, and betrayed the very ideals that its authors claimed to defend. Betrayal had moved from palace intrigues and courtly whispers to conference tables and official seals. It no longer needed daggers or poison, only signatures and silence. The storm of revolution had swept across Europe and beyond. Thrones had fallen, empires had trembled, and the people had risen in the name of liberty. Yet as the 19th century waned, the promises of freedom began to fade. Behind the polished facades of progress, new betrayals were taking root, quieter, colder, and more cunning than before. The world no longer bled for kings, but for ideas, and even ideas could deceive. The ink of Versailles had barely dried when the world began to fracture again, but long before that, betrayal had already infected the very soul of Europe. Even the nations that preached liberty and reason were not immune. In the heart of Paris, decades before the Great War, France, the cradle of democracy, faced a test unlike any other. It was not a war fought with weapons, but with lies. It was not a soldier who fell, but truth itself. In the winter of 1894, inside the dim corridors of the War Office, a single sheet of paper changed everything. It was called the bordereau, an unsigned letter found in a wastebasket inside the German embassy. It spoke of secrets, of betrayal, of a spy within the French army. The generals demanded justice, but what they really wanted was vengeance. They found their scapegoat in Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He was brilliant, disciplined, and loyal, but he was also Jewish. And in that time, it was enough to condemn him. The army whispered, the newspapers screamed. The people, humiliated by defeat and blinded by hatred, wanted someone to blame. And so, without proof, Dreyfus was declared a traitor. The trial was held in secret. Evidence was forged, signatures faked, documents invented. In the courtyard of the École Militaire, his rank was stripped before the jeering crowd. His sword was broken, his buttons torn from his coat. Still he stood tall and cried out, "I am innocent. Long live France." But his words vanished in the roar of the mob. They sent him to Devil's Island, a place of despair off the coast of French Guiana. There, surrounded by sea and silence, he was chained to his bed at night, forbidden even to speak his own name. France had turned its back on him, convinced that it had defended its honor. Years passed. Then quietly, the truth began to surface. Colonel Georges Picard, head of military intelligence, discovered the real traitor, Major Ferdinand Walsenett Esterhazy. But when Picard revealed his findings, the army silenced him. They exiled him to Tunisia, hoping the truth would die with him. To the generals, protecting the institution mattered more than justice. And then came a voice that would shatter the silence. Émile Zola, the famous writer, published his open letter, J'accuse, on the front page of L'Heureux. It was not just a letter, it was a thunderclap that echoed across the Republic. Zola accused the generals, the ministers, and the courts of betraying France herself. His words divided the nation. In every cafe, in every home, people whispered, argued, and chose sides. Families broke apart. Friends became enemies. The country of reason was at war with its own conscience. Zola was tried for defamation and fled to England, but his letter could not be silenced. Slowly the lies began to unravel. Picard returned to testify. Esterhazy's guilt became impossible to hide, and at last, in 1899, Dreyfus was brought back from the island for a retrial. Even then, the court declared him guilty. But the people no longer believed the lie. Under immense pressure, the president granted Dreyfus a pardon. Years later, he was fully exonerated and reinstated into the army, where he would serve honorably in the Great War that soon followed. The Dreyfus affair was more than a scandal. It was a mirror held up to an entire civilization. It revealed how easily justice could be betrayed, not by enemies, but by fear, by pride, and by silence. France learned that betrayal did not always wear a soldier's uniform. Sometimes it wore a judge's robe. And as the century turned, and the world edged closer to the next great catastrophe, the lesson lingered in the air, a quiet warning that truth, once betrayed, never returns unchanged. The 20th century had promised peace. After the slaughter of the Great War, Europe declared itself wiser, more cautious, determined never again to sacrifice a generation in the trenches. But peace is fragile, and memory is short. Beneath the surface of solemn treaties and international pledges, the same forces that had undone kings and toppled empires still lingered: fear, ambition, and the temptation to look away when courage was needed most. By the late 1930s, those forces wore a new face. Adolf Hitler had risen from the wreckage of Germany's defeat, weaving betrayal into his every promise. He spoke of honor, but built power on lies. He promised peace, but prepared only war. Across Europe, leaders watched, wary but unwilling to act. And in 1938, in the city of Munich, the story of betrayal reached its most devastating crescendo. Germany had already annexed Austria without resistance. Now, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a fortified region of Czechoslovakia. He claimed it was about protecting ethnic Germans, but the truth was clear. Without the Sudeten defenses, Czechoslovakia could be taken in days. Prague looked to its allies, France and Britain, bound by treaty to defend it. But in Paris and London, there was hesitation. The people still remembered Verdun and the Somme. They remembered sons who never came home, and they were not ready to risk war again. In September 1938, leaders from Germany, Italy, France, and Britain gathered in Munich. Czechoslovakia itself was not even invited. The fate of a sovereign nation would be decided without its voice. Inside the halls of the Führerbar, Hitler raged, Mussolini played mediator, and the Western leaders folded. Neville Chamberlain clutched at Hitler's promises, desperate to preserve peace. Édouard Daladier followed, unwilling to defy him. Together, they signed the Munich Agreement. The Sudetenland would be handed to Germany. There were no Czech voices at the table, no soldiers, no diplomats, no president. A nation was betrayed not by its enemies, but by its allies. When Chamberlain returned to London, he was greeted as a savior. From the steps of his plane, he waved the signed paper and declared, "Peace for our time." The crowds cheered. In Prague, despair spread like wildfire. President Edvard Beneš resigned, knowing his country had been abandoned. Within 6 months, Hitler broke his promise. German troops marched into Prague. The betrayal was complete. Munich proved that appeasement did not prevent war. It only delayed it by choosing dishonor over courage. The Western powers had invited a catastrophe they could no longer avoid. Winston Churchill said it plainly. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The illusion of peace was shattered. The betrayal of Munich became a lesson etched in blood. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it comes dressed as compromise, written on elegant paper, signed with handshakes and smiles. From Cleopatra's palace to the fall of Constantinople, from Rasputin's murder to the Dreyfus affair, betrayal had haunted every age. But in Munich, it revealed its most dangerous form, the surrender of principles by those sworn to defend them. Czechoslovakia was not betrayed by traitors. It was betrayed by allies who valued comfort over conscience. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, nations stood in ashes, and yet from those ruins emerged a single truth. Peace without justice is no peace at all. As history closed the book on Munich, it left behind more than a record of political failure. It left a warning. Betrayal, when committed in the name of peace, is no less deadly than betrayal in the name of greed. The chronicles of treachery had traveled far, from ancient courts to modern parliaments, from swords to pens, and in every age one truth remained constant. The greatest betrayals are not committed by enemies, but by the silence of those who should have stood firm. And so, the story ends not with triumph, but with a lesson that vigilance is the price of justice, that truth demands courage, and that betrayal, whether of a friend, a people, or a principle, will always echo through time, reshaping the destiny of nations. And so our journey through the long shadows of history comes to an end. From palaces where whispers carried more weight than armies, to city squares where truth was silenced beneath the roar of the crowd, betrayal has revealed itself in many forms. It came with daggers drawn in the dark, with forged letters and broken promises, with treaties signed in silence, and with the quiet indifference of those who chose to look away. What we have uncovered is not only the story of traitors, but of humanity itself, its fears, its ambitions, its fragile trust. Betrayal was never just about kings or nations. It was about principles abandoned, loyalties tested, and choices that reshaped the fate of the world. From Cleopatra to Constantinople, from Rasputin's downfall to the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, and finally to the false peace of Munich, one truth has endured: the greatest wounds in history were not inflicted by enemies, but by those closest to the heart of power. As you close your eyes tonight, let these echoes remind you: vigilance is the price of justice, truth demands courage, and silence in the face of betrayal carries its own terrible cost. History does not only ask us to remember, it asks us to choose again and again whether we stand with truth or let fear and silence shape our destiny. Thank you for walking this path with me through the haunting chronicles of betrayal. If this journey has left you thoughtful, I invite you to share your voice, to leave a comment, to subscribe, and to return for the stories still waiting in the shadows. Until then, may the lessons of the past stay with you, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest hours, the truth, once spoken, can outlast every betrayal.